Yeah, I got half of that. This is hot water. Well, I'm looking familiar. Yeah. Yeah. Where do you live? Okay. Where? I go up there every once in a while. It's nice. Hey, bro, how are you? I'll take your internet. Oh, okay. This is the warm stuff, that's the cold stuff. Yeah. Good. How'd you get stitches? Trail work? Yeah. Until you took it closer. Yeah. Amazing that happens. Are they joining you or are they having that else? Yeah, he's wonderful. Hey, nice to meet you. Well, yeah, feel free. Dig on in. There's one apple cider, hot water for tea, cookies, crackers, and some more. How are you? We're there's lots of stuff happening. I will be doing a great job. As soon as we get this event, it's like, but we yeah. What ended up happening? I love it. Yeah, that's very good.
No, I have not.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We're going to get started. We really appreciate you coming out this evening and tuning in or watching the recording. My name is Joshua Schwartz. I'm with the Mad River Valley Planning District, and I'm pleased to be working with our partners at Friends of the Mad River in making this event a reality. Living with the Mad River, A History of Human Impact and How River Science Informs Us Moving Forward is the title. So Luke and Marcy from Friends of Mad River, Sam and I from the Mad River Valley Planning District are fortunate to be able to support our community in events like this. A couple quick housekeeping things I want to mention. So there's a bathroom in the entranceway on your way in. There's another one this way around the stage and up, but that one's easier to get to. Second, we have some snacks in the front, so don't be shy. I want to thank the Valley Players Theater for making this venue available for this and all sorts of wonderful events in our community for so long. They're great stewards of this space and made it available this evening. We want to thank Mad River Valley Television for recording and live streaming. It'll be available on Waitsville Cable and MRVTV.com after this event. So Shane Jaquith, Watershed Restoration Manager with the Nature Conservancy, is here to share, impart knowledge, and be part of a conversation about our rivers and how we live with them. Shane is no stranger to the Madera Valley. He lived in Facein, I don't know for how long, but 12 or so years, and served this community on the Friends of Mad River Board, on the Facein Planning Commission. Served for 16 years as a river scientist with the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources, the Vermont Rivers Program, and he lives just over the mountain over in Huntington. So thank you for coming over, and it's probably a bit of a homecoming being here. Shane also participated in the Lessons from the 2023 Floods panel that Friends of Mad River held back in January at the Warren School. So it was a part of that conversation as well. About a month after the July 10th, 2024 flooding event, I participated in a Vermont Flood Managers Zoom call and presentation that Shane was a part of. And I learned a lot. I felt like I had some understanding of this topic, but I left with a much greater understanding of river science and the history of river management in the state of Vermont. And I was struck that the conversation that I was listening to and learning reflected a lot of the questions that I was hearing in our community after those floods on Front Porch Forum and the paper at Three Mountain Cafe. And so the idea was to bring Shane to share some of his learning and perspective and engage in a conversation. So we'll have a 30, 40 or so minute presentation, and then about 20 or so minutes for a Q&A at the end. So thank you, Shane.
Need some sort of time piece to make sure that I don't drown on too long. Thanks. Got it. And then I need to figure out how to use the gadget. Okay.
And just so you know, there is dance practice.
Not yet. Not yet. All right. Yeah. Thanks everybody for coming out.
Shane, one more thing.
Yeah.
Can I use the microphone just so it picks up on the television?
Can I pop that off so I can move around?
Yeah.
Maybe I can. Is that registering? Yeah, okay. Great. Okay. All right, that's good. Yeah, okay. Thank you. So yeah, river scientist with the Nature Conservancy since 2016, and 20 years before that with the Agency of Natural Resources. And in both those jobs, a big focus of my work is really trying to figure out how we derive the greatest values from rivers and at the same time minimize our conflicts with rivers. And I've done that largely by being in the role of providing technical assistance to farmers, transportation infrastructure managers, homeowners, et cetera. And it's always really rewarding to help people understand how rivers work and why they do what they do. Because while it's not really intuitive, it's not rocket science either. So it's not terribly difficult to help people understand sufficiently how rivers work and why they do what they do, so that those people can better achieve their goals, whether that's water quality, flood resiliency, improve ecosystems, whatever it might be. It's not terribly hard to get people enough of an understanding so that they can make informed decisions and help themselves better achieve their goals. So that's what I'm hoping comes out of this discussion tonight. So yeah, I'm going to start with the types of flood damage, a little bit about flood history and future forecasts. So the types of flood damage, and this is important because we manage to mitigate these different types of damage differently, or we can and the costs around these different types of damage are different, and the causes of these damage are somewhat different. So inundation and erosion are the two primary types of damage caused by flood events, right? An inundation is simply water rising, saturating buildings, dumping sediment in the basements. I fear that a lot of you have probably had to deal with that, mucking out basements. I know in Moortown that was something that something that needed to be done quite a bit. Montpelier, of course, right? So that's inundation. Buildings get wet, so that's inundation. Then there's erosion damage, right? And it's simply when rivers adjust dramatically during flood events, right? These really large-scale channel adjustments that erode public investments, transportation networks, homes, businesses, et cetera. And while inundation damage is really traumatic, it's expensive, it's really damaging for those that experience it, it is actually erosion damage that's much, much more expensive to the state as a whole to recover from, right? Rebuilding that length of roadway, houses that have fallen into the river, dealing with those situations is much more expensive to deal with. So I just want to mention that right out of the gate, because I hear people talk about flooding and flood damage, and it's not often that people actually make the distinction, and it's important that we do, and we'll get into why. So taking a little bit of a shift here, just looking at a history of flooding in Vermont. So the National Weather Service had a list of the 5 top floods. We added the Great Flood of 23 to it because it racked up quite a bit of damage. That 500 million is an estimate that I came up with after looking at a number of different resources today. It seems that we still don't have a firm number on that as far as I can tell, but it seems that we're somewhere around the $500 million damage. And those are 2023 dollars. All those other numbers are 2012 dollars. So the point being that we have a long history of large flood events. It's not something that's different than we've experienced in the past. But perhaps those flood events are becoming more frequent. So going back to 1973, the Department of Environmental Conservation Rivers Program compiled information on floods going back to 1973. And when you add that other information, go back to 27, what we see is that between 1927 and 23, we have experienced 5 large-scale disastrous floods, or about 1 every 20 years. A large scale is nearly statewide, right? At least a half, if not 2/3 of the state. And then between 73 and 2011, we've experienced 19 disastrous floods. And by disastrous, these are floods that have resulted in disaster declarations. So these are severe events. They're disastrous. And we experience those about every 1 or 2 years. So those are relatively frequent as well. They're smaller geographically, but they are more frequent, and where they do occur, they are damaging. Okay, so let's see what's going on here. Okay, and looking forward, right? This image shows us that this is from Climate Central. That between 1958 to 2011, the amount of precipitation falling in the form of heavy rainfall, really severe magnitude events, has increased by 74%. And we know from ongoing climate research and forecasting that that's only going to continue. So we're going to continue to experience more rainfall as really severe events, high magnitude events. So we should expect more flooding more frequently going forward. Yeah, so here's a study from Science News. Extreme precipitation, Northeast will increase by 52% by the end of the century. The Gund Institute at UVM, property damage from flooding, calculated to exceed 5.2 billion over the next 100 years. So, it's an expensive forecast. It's an expensive future. All right, so let's get away from all that negative stuff for a minute, shift gears and talk about some basic science. So river morphology, that's just morphology being shape or form. We're going to talk about the shape and form of rivers. And We talk about the shape of form in rivers largely within the science of fluvial geomorphology, which is simply the study of landforms created by flowing water, rivers, right? Big fancy name for studying the shape and form of rivers. And we're going to talk about this concept of equilibrium a little bit too. So this is really going to be nuts and bolts. This is the type of presentation that I typically give to transportation infrastructure managers, VTrans, municipal road crews, just to explain the nuts and bolts, because I think it's really important for us all to really come to a common understanding. So apologies to those who prefer sort of high-level presentations, but we're going to go nuts and bolts here a little bit. So when we talk about the morphology of the river, there are four primary factors or characteristics that we talk about. We talk about the cross-section of the river, which is the width and depth of the channel for the most part. We talk about the planform, which is the way that the shape of the meanders of the river as it meanders or doesn't through the valley, as looking at it from above. We talk about the profile of the river, which is really just the slope of the river. And we talk about the bed forms in the river. And that's taking a close look at the profile and seeing the ways that the vertical undulations of the riverbed. We have step pool rivers and much steeper rivers, and riffle pool rivers and the flatter rivers like the Mad River. Where it gets really flat, we have ripple dune, where it's like sand bed streams and you get those ripples and dunes. So those are the ways that we talk about the morphology of the river. So the morphology of the river, I wonder, do I? Oh, I do. Look at that. So the morphology of the river over here, right, the cross section, the slope and bed forms, and the planform really reflect the shape of the valley. So this is a narrow, steep valley, moderate slope and width valley, and a very wide and flat valley, right? And it turns out that these different morphologies set up in these different valley types. So, you can think of the river really being a reflection of the valley form. And if you think about that, so for the last 10,000 or 13,000 years since the glaciers retreated, flowing water has been running through these valleys, creating these forms, these channels, right? In these very specific forms. And it's the same shape, in valleys of the same size. So you can almost think of it like there's a most probable form for a river within a valley. And that most probable form is dictated really by the laws of physics, right? And laws of nature. It's physics and biology that are at work constantly to shape these rivers and create a river that fits that most probable form. So we can expect that when we change the shape of the river, those same forces, gravity, et cetera, that are continuously at work are going to fight that change that we make and try to revert back to the shape that was naturally occurring here before we made those changes. Good, bad, or otherwise, that's just a fact. And if we can all, start with that as a fact, I think, that's the first step to come into common understanding, right? Any change that we make is going to be resisted by the natural forces and processes at play. The form of the river is also a result of the inputs from the watershed, the amount of those inputs being water, sediment, and wood primarily. As the amount of water changes over time, or the amount of sediment changes over time, the river is going to change, right? So if we're in a location with high precip, a lot of water running through our valley, our river channel is going to be bigger, right? Because all that water is going to erode the channel to accommodate that water for the most part. As we change the amount of water that reaches the river, we build roads, we build drainage networks. That drainage, ditch catches the overland flow and shoots it right down to the river. As we expose soils, those soils are more easily eroded and transported to the river. That's all gonna bring about a response of the river. So the river is always changing in response to what's going on in the watershed. Okay, so a little bit more about how that works. So back in, I think, the mid-50s or 40s to 50s, I guess, a hydraulic engineer by the name of Emery Lane, who worked, I think, originally for, he worked for the federal government, I can't remember, but then went to Colorado State University, became a professor, came up with this idea of a balance to just help people understand the real basics of how rivers work. And really, he was an engineer who was looking at what the geomorphologists were saying about rivers and how they work. And he was telling all of his engineer colleagues, look, you all, we need to start listening to the geomorphologists, because a lot of what we do and the ways that we think about engineering rivers totally ignores what the geomorphologists know and are telling us. And we need to start to pay attention because it'll benefit our engineering efforts. So he came up with this idea. There's a big paper behind this. It wasn't just a picture like this, right? Like, these are engineers, they need papers, right? So there's a big paper behind this. And so, but basically it boils down to this, like, if the power of the water is in balance with the resistance of the channel doesn't erode and it doesn't fill. It's stable. It's as stable as a river in nature can be. This is, do we still call this Kidd's Brook that runs down from the East Warren Plateau? Is that Kidd's Brook we still call it? Yeah, I think this is Kidd's Brook, like behind, up on the plateau. And back in, like, I think I took this in 96 or something, this was a pretty stable river, right? It's not filling, it's not eroding. That's a pretty stable river. So that's the idea of the balance. Now, if we move to, this is the Lye Brook down in Manchester, and just upstream of this image, all this brightness is the reflection off a massive bare spot left behind by a massive landslide. So the resistance, the amount of material overwhelmed the power of the flow, and the channel filled in. Like, this is the floodplain right here, right? It's completely filled in. So, you know, we tipped the scale towards the resistance and we filled the channel, right? Pretty straightforward. And on the other, and going the other way, if the power of the flow exceeds the resistance, then the channel starts to erode. It gets bigger, it enlarges. Didn't mean to jump the gun there. So yeah, that's the basics of Lane's balance, right? And there's this constant balance going on. And if we can achieve equilibrium, that most probable form, it's really in our best interest, because it's the minimal, you know, we're minimizing the amount that the river's moving and adjusting and conflicting with our adjacent investments. So let's look a little more closely. Again, this is nuts and bolts, getting a little deeper, and talk about what goes on either side of this balance. So looking at the power side, power is a function of the slope of the channel, the depth of the channel, or water in the channel, and discharge. Sorry for the shakiness. I knew from the age of 8 that I was never going to be a surgeon. I don't know why. I've had these shaking hands my whole life. My wife sometimes, even though she's, you know, known me for 20 some odd years, she's still like, "Do you sure we don't have to go to the hospital to deal with that?" So yeah, so this is always difficult for me. So slope and depth, and then of course the discharge. And discharge, the volume of water moving through the channel, of course, affects the depth. And then, yeah, so let's get into that a little bit more. Let's talk a little bit more about slope and depth. So stream power, flow depth that we just saw affects stream power, is affected, of course, by the amount of water, right? The more water, the deeper the river is. None of you needed to come here tonight to have that explained to you. But flow depth is also affected by channel width. So here's a case where we have a channel that's 100 feet wide. And let's just hypothetically say we run 10,000 gallons per minute. I use gallons per minute with all the road folks because they understand gallons per minute a lot better than they do cubic feet per second, right? So let's say we run 10,000 gallons per minute down this 100-foot wide channel. It's going to be, well, that's what it's going to look like, right? It's going to be relatively shallow. But if we narrow that channel way down and we run that same 10,000 GPM through that channel, a 60-foot wide channel, that volume of water is going to have to increase in depth, right? Because it doesn't have the same width. Now, here's the thing. Every cubic foot of water, so cubic foot, like a milk crate, weighs 62.4 pounds. So for every foot of depth of water in that square foot area, that water is bearing down and dragging across that bed or down that bed, right? So 62, another foot, someone help me with the math, like 114 or 18, 124. Another foot, add another 60 points on that 1 square foot, bearing down, scraping whatever's on that bed, and all of that material starts to move. So that's the way that depth relates to or increases power. So just keep that in mind. The width of the channel can influence depth, and depth influences power, resulting in more or less erosion. So here's a real world example in cartoon. So let's say we start with that wide channel. We've got the river channel, we've got the floodplain. This is the natural formation of river channels. I think we all know that. You can think of this formation as a low flow channel, what we all think of as a channel, and the floodplain being the high flow channel, right? So that when those flows come up, we get those really high flows, those big precipitation events, that water gets spread out, the depth is governed, right? It can only get so deep because you get so much width, right? The floodplain is really the blow-off valve. It's the pressure relief system, pressure relief component in the whole system. But the problem is, right, when we make investments in that floodplain, they get inundated. So what do we do typically, right? And we have done this not just in Vermont, not just in the US, around the world since people could figure out how to dig dirt, we've done channels deeper so that they wouldn't flood whatever we had next to them. It just makes sense, right? Like, who wouldn't do that? The problem is you start thinking about that depth and its relation to power and what that power does to the bed. You start increasing all the stress on the bed, on the toe of the bank, and what happens, right? This gives way, and then you've just traded out your flooding problem for an erosion problem. And like, I think it's pretty easy to accept, again, that inundation is a lot less expensive to deal with than erosion, right? So that is one of the reasons that we try to think about and analyze and design dredging river management operations so that we're not just digging so deep everywhere and unknowingly creating this erosion hazard. It's taken us a long time to figure that out, even the professionals. Really, when I came on board at A&R in 1998, there were river management engineers on board at that time that we were all getting exposed to this stuff at that time. And they would say, oh my gosh, I have been doing exactly the opposite of what I should be doing. And I've seen what happens. I now understand why those rivers, I can't ever solve the problems with these eroding rivers, right? So we haven't understood this as a river management community for that long. I think the scientists have, going back to the 50s, but it takes so long for knowledge to transfer in and be applied. So this isn't really that old. And we're still trying to do just this, help others understand this. Okay, so that's depth and power. Where am I at time? I feel like I'm 20 minutes so far? Yeah. Okay. That means I have another 20. I better hit the gas here a little bit. So that's depth. So then there's slope, right? Slope, the other factor in power. So it's hard to change this. Well, it's kind of hard to change the slope of a stream, you might think, but when you realize that, right, slope is all about horizontal distance and elevational distance, rise over run, right? We all can remember that from algebra. So a river meandering has a different length than a river that's straight. So when we go in and we straighten a river to accommodate a surrounding land use, we're actually shortening that river channel, right? And shortening that river channel, so this shortened horizontal leads to a greater slope. Again, we're increasing power, and that's increasing the erosivity of that channel and getting to greater erosion hazards, okay? All right, on the other side of the equation is resistance. Resistance to that power that we were just talking about. And really it comes down to the amount and the size of the sediment and a few other things that I'm just gonna talk about really quickly. So resistance or roughness is created by bed forms. I talked earlier about bed forms. So step pool bed forms, plain bed systems, ripple dune, cascade systems. These are all providing resistance. They're causing the water to turn, to scour. Anywhere you see white water, that's energy dissipation. That's heat being created and energy being burned. So when you see white water, yeah, that's energy being burned. That's energy, that's resistance going on in that channel. Meander bends. Meander bends are a form of roughness or resistance, right? The water has to turn around that bend. It gets slowed down. It gets forced into this helical flow pattern. It has to scour the bed and deposit that sediment up here. It's slowing down. It's losing energy so that downstream its impact isn't as great. So meanders are roughness, and not just important for slope, but they're important as a roughness element. Gravel bars themselves are a roughness element. The river picks up this gravel and moves it to the next bar during a flood event, right? So it's bearing the burden of that gravel, slowing it down, it's taking the energy out of it. We often see scour downstream of dams. A lot of us probably heard about the hungry water effect downstream of dams. That's because the water flowing over the dam crest doesn't carry gravel, right? Because it's ponded up, all the gravel drops out, and then it slowly flows over the dam crest, and it doesn't have any gravel. It's got a lot more energy, so you get that scour. That's that hungry water effect. So gravel in the system helps burn energy of that system. Large wood is a really important roughness element. It, again, slows water, creates energy dissipation, white water. It holds sediment in place. So large wood's a really important element in maintaining that balance or equilibrium in the river system. So altogether, equilibrium depends on the width of the channel, and we often reduce the width when we build, when we restore road embankments. It depends on the depth of the channel, which we often increase after a flood event because we think digging the river out deeper is going to save us next time, maybe from flooding, but again, it's going to make the erosion situation worse. It depends on roughness elements. We often recover by floods by just sending the dozer down the channel and smoothing it out. There's no roughness in that channel whatsoever. That's the White River after Irene. And the slope, we often straighten the river out to accommodate adjacent land uses. That's the Winooski Valley, and you can see those meander bends that were cut off to accommodate the rail bed and the interstate. So we increase the slope of the Winooski there. And discharge, and we affect discharge in different ways, right? The whole stormwater issue is about controlling discharge so that we're not increasing it and energizing the stream. And then sediment size and quantity, again, things we do on the landscape. Erosion prevention, sediment control that some of you might have had to put in place if you've done a construction project. That's all about stabilizing sediment so we're not tilting that balance between the power of the flow and the sediment, right? All right, so moving on. This is another example of dredging. I already showed the one with the house. It's the same thing. Low channel banks, access to the floodplain. A lot of standing trees, that is real roughness right there. When hydraulic engineers model rivers, they add roughness as a parameter. You turn the dial and set your roughness number. And whenever you have large trees or trees and shrubbery on the floodplain, that number goes way up. So trees in the floodplain is super important. When that channel is deeper and the flood comes along and fills that channel, it gets really deep and that water can't access the floodplain, all that weight's bearing on the banks or the bed and the toes of the channel, you get that sort of situation, right? So again, that connectivity to the floodplain is super important. The floodplain is a pressure relief valve. I'm going to skip this. This is head cutting. This is what happens when you dig a hole in a riverbed and you create a steep face, not always vertical. But what happens is that face migrates. That's referred to as a nick point, and it migrates in the upstream direction. So if you keep your eye down here, over time, that moves in the upstream direction. And now the distance between the bed of the channel, which was there, and the floodplain is much greater. Again, you're disconnecting the channel from the floodplain. The water can't get up on the floodplain and access that pressure relief valve. Head cutting. We all I think about damage in rivers happening from upstream to downstream with the flow of the water. Pollution works that way, certainly. But this is something that a lot of people don't realize. Damage can actually this incision can migrate in the upstream direction. So that's something, like lots of times you'll have a bridge, you have a wetland or some other infrastructure, and that head cut will migrate up through that bridge, and all of a sudden you can see the abutment footers exposed after that. So that's the type of damage that can happen associated with head cutting. So all of that, let's move into our history of channel management and the response. Right? We have a long history of channel management. And watershed management, right? We largely cleared, Vermont was 80% deforested at one point. We've been, using equipment to dredge rivers and build berms along those rivers, disconnecting them from floodplains, berming again, armoring them, steam shovels to straighten them, modern day equipment, dynamite to streamline streams. Crooked streams are a menace, et cetera, straighten it with dynamite. We built so many splash dams to facilitate logging, during the early days of logging. Earlier than this, we nearly extirpated beaver, which have a huge influence on slowing water, holding water on the landscape. So all of these alterations and management activities that we've done on our river, that we've engaged in river management. So here's one of them, right? We've straightened rivers to accommodate land uses. And we talked about what the impacts of straightening, shortening the river, getting rid of the meanders leads to in terms of power and a lack of decreasing resistance and tilting that balance. So here's like Lower Granville. A lot of you are probably familiar with this, right? That river is oddly, sort of peculiarly right along the toe of the valley wall. When it does cross the valley, again, it's like right along the toe of the valley wall. It really conveniently creates space for the land use there, right? Like that is not a natural river planform geometry. Over in Huntington, where I live, same thing. Right along the toe of the valley wall, leaving all of the floodplain bottom open for other land uses and really straight angular bends, right? That is not a natural formation. Here in the Black Creek in Fairfield, not up against the valley wall, but right along the rail bed. And there's the old meander loop that they cut off to put in the rail bed, and really straight and really interesting, angular bends. And again, Winooski. So we've done this around the state. We've done it for a long time. It's been done throughout the country and around the world, really. This is just the way that humans see rivers and the way that what is logical to manage them, right? It's intuitive. So now what's the response to that? All that straightening, throwing that balance, right, out of whack, increasing the power, decreasing the resistance. So this is a well understood evolution process that rivers go through. And there are a number of different models that describe this process, but they all are pretty much the same fundamentally. So we start here with a river pre-disturbance. There's a house on the floodplain, but nothing's been done to the channel, but the house gets wet frequently. So, and this is stage one. And, good access to the floodplain, fairly low bank, so that's pretty stable. It has that pressure relief valve. Then we move to stage two, and in this case, in the diagram, the homeowners built berms to prevent the houses and the house and the field from getting flooded, disconnecting the river from that pressure relief valve, increasing the depth in the channel. That excessive erosive energy goes to work on the bed, and the channel downcuts, leaving really high banks. And you can see the erosion here. It's that vertical downcutting that's so damaging. Then the river gets so deep, the channel gets so deep that gravity takes over and the banks fail in and the river goes into this widening phase. So much gravel comes in that the bars get really big, pushes the river around side to side. Eventually, these bars build high enough that they start to vegetate and stabilize, and that gets us to stage 5, which is sort of a valley set within the old valley and the channel in there. Same configuration as you had up here, but you've lost all that landmass and any investments along the river in that whole process. So it's hard to see from the landform, so I drew in this line, but here's the old upper terrace. Here's the new lower floodplain in the channel. This is up in Troy. This is just heavily impacted by agricultural land use before an easement got put on it, and it went through this incision and widening, and it's got this new inset floodplain. So that's the full channel evolution process. If you keep that in mind and look around, you might start to notice streams that you look at that have gone through that process. They're pretty prevalent. In fact, the Agency of Natural Resources, the Rivers Program, assessed 5,000 miles of river, including the Mad River and some of the tributaries. And of that 5,000 miles that were assessed, and this was field assessment with survey equipment, they found that 75% are undergoing channel evolution in one of these 3 stages where they don't have access to the floodplain. They're highly unstable. They're just ripe for massive erosion. And that is really why, well, that's one of the major reasons why when we get these large flood events, we experience so much erosive damage. So our rivers are just very unstable. They're just primed to collapse when large volumes of water move through them, because they don't have that connection to the floodplain, because we've deepened the channel. So where do we find ourselves? We find ourselves in this cycle of encroaching on the river because it seems okay. Then the flood comes through and we experience property damage. And then we armor and dredge the river. We dredge it to keep the water off of, out of away from our investments. And then we armor it to keep it from moving. And then we encroach upon it even further because we feel like we're safe now. This is now a safe place. But what we ultimately find out is that the spit or rock here isn't going to hold. And the river's just going to downcut and get underneath it, undermine it, and fail it. And house structures like this one are really compromised, if not failed by a flood event. So we're in the cycle, right? We're trying to break out of that cycle, or at least, we're trying to break out of that cycle. So where do we go from here? How do we move forward to increase flood resiliency, improve water quality, and freshwater ecosystem health? How much time do I have? 5 minutes? 8. All right, that's pretty good. So one of the things that we've done, and this has been a work in progress going back to probably 2008, is this idea of identifying river corridors, which are those areas in which we expect the river will move in order to achieve the length that it needs to bring the slope down, to bring it and maintain that balance, right? So it's not excessively, or it's that most probable form. And based on the scientific literature, the state came up with a methodology for identifying and mapping that river corridor. There's a map. If you go, there's a map. I'll just leave it at that. And I can, if anybody's interested, I can tell you how to find it. That shows where the river corridors are. And after the 2023 flood events, the last legislative session, the legislature passed, and the governor either signed or just let go across his desk without vetoing, I can't remember which, the Flood Safety Act, which some of you may have heard about. It addresses dam safety, it addresses wetland impacts, and it addresses protection of river corridors. So in 2028, I think 2028 is the start date, there will be a permitting program that any proposed development within a river corridor will have to go through to move on, right? So the idea is we're keeping structures out of harm's way and we're giving the river the room it needs to reestablish that longer form, decrease its slope, and become more stable. So that was a big move for the legislature in terms of flood safety and flood resiliency this past session. And at TNC, we did a bunch of polling. We were pushing for this, and we did a bunch of polling. And it was, the pollsters said they never see as much bipartisan support for legislation as they saw for this one. Of course, it was right after 2023. But bipartisan support, I think it was like 67% of support for limiting development within river corridors. So this was strongly supported across Vermont. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly show the difference between river corridors and floodplains, and maybe I should have put a couple more slides in here explaining what floodplains are, but floodplains are those areas that get inundated by water during a 100-year storm event, or what we like to call the 1% exceedance probability flood, which means that in any given year, there's a 1% chance that that area will be flooded, right? That's better than saying 100-year flood, because when you say 100-year flood, people say, oh, we had a 100-year flood last year. I'm never going to see another one in my lifetime. But that's not really the way it works. It's next year there's a 1% chance, and the year after that there's a 1% chance. And as I think we all have heard, maybe agree with, or at least have heard with climate change, that frequency of those large-scale events is only going to increase, right? So the floodplains are regulated by FEMA. The towns adopt floodplain standards that tell us how we have to build in a floodplain. If we're going to build in a floodplain, the whole idea is to reduce our flood damage so that we can actually insure homes in floodplains. It's not such a risk that we can't insure them, so that we can insure homes so that if they are impacted, there's insurance protection. So they tell people how to build in floodplains, elevate and things of that nature, building standards. And that's shown, that floodplain is shown in the red. The new river corridor that the state map, and the floodplain's mapped by FEMA, the river corridor that the state map lies on that same map. And so now development along the river will be regulated by these two polygons. In some places, the river corridor is wider. In some places, the floodplain is wider. It really just depends on the width of the valley bottom, right? If you have a very wide valley bottom, the floodwaters can spread out, so that floodplain is going to be really wide. If you have sloping side slopes in the valley bottom, that water can't really spread out. Or if you have an incised river, right? How we talked about how we've disconnected. So a lot of these maps were done in the 80s, long after we incised our river channels by dredging them. So the floodplains, a lot of these channels have no floodplains, not because they wouldn't have floodplains, but because we deepen the rivers and the water at a 100-year flood event just doesn't get out of the channel anymore. So in those areas, in areas where naturally the flood just isn't wide, the river corridor is wider, okay? Not super important, sometimes people are interested in that, but this is the way, this is what's regulating development now along rivers to improve flood safety, flood resiliency. I think a lot of you maybe know this. This is upstream or downstream of Butternut Hill Road, across from Yes Tomorrow. I haven't been in the valley, okay, so yes. So this was right after 98. And this is an example of a structure that was not in the floodplain. There was no regulation. The homeowner had no idea they were at such risk, because this is never going to flood, right? But it's in a very erosion-prone area, right? So this is the type of scenario that drove folks to say, wait a minute, we need to start understanding erosion hazards and making sure that people understand when they're in these erosion hazard areas, okay? And that's the whole idea of the river corridor protection. All right, so what do we do going forward? Probably 3 minutes or so, 2, 3, yeah, okay. What do we do going forward? One, we can restore river floodplain connection. So we can do that. This is one of the ways we can do it. This is a project that I did up in Fairfield on the Boomhauer Farm. Wonderful people, long-term residents, just great people. Not that it didn't take me like 10 conversations at the kitchen table to get them to do this project instead of just rip-rap the whole thing, which is what they initially wanted to do. But they had all these failing banks, and the river was incised. It doesn't get out and flood when it should. So a lot of extra energy in the channel and failing banks and incising bed. So what we did in this situation, and is done fairly commonly, although it's really expensive, is we excavated that floodplain down. So now there's a floodplain next to the river, and the bank height's much lower. Now that river can flood out, dissipate the energy during high flow events. We also vegetated it. And earlier this year, folks over at Vermont Land Trust, who hold the easement on this farm, went out and were checking things out. And this is what they found. So we have this wonderful river, well vegetated, low bank still, access to the floodplain. It's really in a great condition. That's one thing we can do. We can reconnect our rivers to the floodplain. But that's super expensive. So probably not going to happen everywhere. Here's another approach. We can more simply take a simpler approach. So I'll get into what that approach is. It's adding large wood. And I know wood is a very hot topic of discussion along with dredging these days. But it's adding large wood, because wood, if you think about it, the glaciers went out 13,000 years ago. And maybe it took, I don't know, how many thousands of years for the landscape to vegetate? Let's say it was 2,000, give it 3,000 years. That's still, what, 10,000 years of rivers flowing through a vegetated landscape? How many generations of trees grew, died, and fell onto the forest floor and into the rivers in that 10,000 years? Our rivers were loaded with large wood. They were loaded with large wood. And that is a massive roughness element. Rivers didn't flow like they did today. They kind of slowly made their way from maybe Beaver Pond to the upstream side of a wood jam, right? The dominant form was not the single thread channel that we have today. So wood's important. It's also important for habitat. So it's long been a habitat improvement approach, but we're starting to understand it's also really important for the stability of rivers. So here's a really incised, this is like 14 feet wide. The banks of this thing should be like a foot high. They're at least 3.5, they're about 3.5 feet high, okay? From the bed to the bank, right? That's about 3.5 feet. So it's separated, it's disconnected from its floodplain. Here's that same channel. So I missed a slide in here. I should have had another one in here. We hired a restoration company, Red Start Forest Management, they're forestry and restoration oriented folks, to go in and build wood jams. Like, you cut these trees down along the bank, they fall into the river, you kind of manipulate them to build a structure that's got some integrity, and maybe 3 or 5 trees, and then you go in and do the next one. We did a mile of river and we built 32 structures. This is on Cobb Brook, which is a tributary to the West River in the town of Windham. It's a high elevation, fairly high gradient stream. You can see from the incised condition that the stream's got a lot of power by the fact that the bed material is enormous. Everything that's smaller, there's some stuff that's held on and maybe been washed in over time, but it's largely this big stuff because there's so much power in this river that all the small stuff gets washed out. And with that small stuff is phosphorus found in those materials. So this is where water quality comes in, right? Also nutrients that support the food web of that river system. So it's a super powerful river, energized by the fact that it's incised. Why is it incised? It was a logging land, a logging area, and there were berms there to protect the log landings and things like that. You could see that it was dredged in certain places. The wood was all taken out of it. So we built all those structures in 2020. 2023 flood hit and hit really hard down there. Some like Londonderry, right? Areas in the West River watershed hit really hard. Picked up all our structures, took them downstream, dropped them in new locations, but built these massive structures out of the wood that we put in there. So where we had 3.5-foot banks, in this stream, the structures got reconfigured by the flood events, and then on the upstream side of those structures, the sediment filled in, and we filled that channel with wood. So the bank height is now about 1.5 foot tall. That's it. We filled that channel. We reconnected that river to the floodplain, and this condition goes upstream for about 150 feet. So we can hold material, and if we think about our problems with material down in the lower watershed, where we have a lot more development and how gravel causes problems, we can hold a lot of that material up in these headwater streams where it really belongs, and to fill up these channels and get them back to the condition that they should be, so that the floodwaters spread out across the floodplain, slow down, dissipate energy, and it makes our lower valley communities more flood resilient. This is a flood resiliency issue, as well as a habitat issue, and it's a river restoration issue. So we are actually reversing. We're going from this stage 3 of that evolution model, we're reversing it. Instead of going down here, we're going back to stage 1. Early in my career, we talked about this idea. What do we do with all these incised channels like the Mad River and all the smaller ones? How do we fill them back in so that they have access to the floodplain? And the answer was you can't. And we came up with those ideas of digging down the floodplain. It's so expensive. We can't. And it's really cheap to pay a crew of sawyers to go up and fell trees into the river. It's really cheap. And I know some of us have played around with these ideas long ago and found the same truths out of those projects. Here's another image from looking downstream to upstream. This is another location on that same brook. That is a massive sediment deposit trapped by this wood that filled the channel bed. And here it is from looking upstream to downstream. This is a cartoon to simulate this guy, my colleague Murray. But this is all bedload that otherwise would have been taken further downstream during this flood event, trapped up, restoring the brook, restoring floodplain connectivity. And that's it.
So, yeah, we're happy to take questions.
Yeah, I'm happy to take your questions. Right? Okay.
And Shane, if you wouldn't mind repeating any questions, just so we make sure we get it on camera.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah. So yeah, any questions?
I'm really interested in the fact that we fill the river with sand.
That the state what?
Well, we sand the roads in
Yes.
the winter
Yes.
and in the spring.
Yes.
And this winter.
Yeah. Yeah. So what are we doing to address that? So the first thing, like stepping back, if we think about all the gravel that we've taken out.
What was the question?
Oh, thank you. So there's a concern with the amount of sand that we put on our roads and that gets into the river. Yes, you can say it again. Yes.
So I moved here in 1970.
1970.
Very long time ago.
Yep.
And the river, the Mad River, all the way from Warren to Middlesex, was a smooth rock bottom.
Yep.
And we hardly had any floods.
Yep.
And then I was, stupid and I voted for not dredging in the river because they said, well, we're getting diesel in the river and it's killing the fish. And I said, okay, well, that's not a good idea.
Yeah.
Let's vote for that. So for 40, 50 years now, we've been sanding the roads, it goes into the river, and instead of letting the farmers take it out the way they did every spring before,
Yeah.
it lives there.
Yeah.
And now we have tons of sand going into the river every single year and nobody's taking it out.
Yeah. So what are we trying to do to address that? So that sand is, if it's problematic, it's because it's so fine that, right, it's much smaller. Like the natural river cobbles, right, gravels and cobbles and boulders, that sand is super small, right? It is so fine that it fills in all of those interstitial spaces between the gravels and cobbles that are really important to transport water and well oxygenated water for fish to build spawning reds.
Right.
So spawning reds have to be kind of coarse sand to gravel. These fine sands that we put on our roads, there's such a fine content. Sometimes we put clay, right? Silt clay is actually good because it seals it pretty nice until the rain comes, and then you've got a really slick road. It does the same in the riverbed, and it clogs up those interstitial spaces, and it prevents the ability of fish, brook trout, to spawn. Right? It really impacts that process. So there's that. The volume of the gravel that we put on roads, someone asked me the same question in Huntington, and I looked, it's probably like about 25% of the amount of gravel that we would expect naturally to come into the river. So it's an impact. It has been probably an impact, but it's really small, so it's easily transported. I think more of what we're seeing. Yes, it is going somewhere. It is. It definitely is. So what are we trying to do to address it? So the state established probably back in 2014, established the municipal roads general permit. So that required all towns to assess their roads and the drainage networks and identify those drainages, those ditches that were going straight into wetlands or surface water, other surface waters, rivers, and do a better job to implement best management practices to reduce the amount of sand going from the roads into the ditches. So there was rock line ditches, grass lining of ditches if the slopes were appropriate ditch sizes, good crowns on the road so we wouldn't have as much erosion off the road. So that is the way that the state's trying to tackle that issue.
But they haven't stopped taking it out. They haven't stopped adding.
No. So the thing is, like, if you look at how much gravel we removed going back to the 20s, if not earlier, we removed so much gravel from our rivers that there really is a deficiency. There's a deficit of gravel. So if you're thinking about it like the gravel's filling in the river and that's causing more floods, if we think about what I was saying about the river being able to access the floodplain so that the energies in the channel are less, to reduce the energy and the erosion, this is the trade-off. And there's no simple solution. And the rivers used to be cold and fast and deep.
And we had fish everywhere. When I moved here, I grew up in a fishing family. We would dive in the river, look around and see where the fish were and cast it.
Yeah.
Now there's no fish.
Yeah.
They have to put them in.
Yeah. We hear that a lot. And I'm not the fishery biologist, so I can't speak to fish populations over time.
I know the fisheries biologists, they monitor, right? And I don't know where they monitor them at, if they monitor them. I think they have monitoring stations on that. But what I can say is that,
And I wish, like, maybe I should have some slides on this. Well, that's not. Oh my gosh.
My point is that it worked before, then we started fooling around with it, adding material to the rivers and not taking it out.
Yes.
But it worked fine before when they let people take it out, the farmers took it out in the spring.
Well, I think that they took out, the problem that we're seeing, and the reason that in 1986, the state started to regulate gravel removal. Before in 86, you could sell gravel. It was going for about $2 a yard, which at that time was a good price for an easy material to get. But they were seeing that there was so much gravel extraction that we were disconnecting the river from the floodplain. And that's when they started to regulate it. So we were taking more than, we were destabilizing the channels. I'm trying to find that slide. I'm not going to do it. So that's really intent on finding a slide, but I should stop. Yeah. So like what I can definitely say, and I've worked with the biologists a lot, is that that's not good fish habitat. That's not good fish habitat, right? Like, but that's a river that was just hogged out. That's just not like, you need nooks and crannies and crevices and wood. You need deep pools. And when we dredge the rivers, we don't end up with that. So that's like an impact to the fishery from dredging. And the gravel, when it comes into the river and builds those bars, if you think about it, maybe it's not always true because you don't always get the bars, but when you get the bars, you're actually narrowing the width of the channel at low flow. So the water is deeper because you're narrowing it. That's better fish habitat, right? Because you're narrowing the channel and increasing the depth of the water.
Fish dive out of the warren covered bridge.
And grab fish.
Never touched the bottom.
Yeah. Oh, I believe
Now
that.
you can walk across without getting your knees wet.
Right. I believe that. But what
But
that
nobody
is.
stretched that river, nobody screwed around with the direction of that river, except we just keep adding sand.
Right. And it's the river's filling up.
Yes.
And so, yeah.
There's a giant dam right there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, no, but I mean, all the way back to the beginning.
Yeah. So again, where we go back to, like what we always want to understand, and we're starting to understand the better as a scientific community, is what these rivers looked like before European settlement. And before European settlement, there have been studies done around the world. This all started coming out around 2000. The deep single thread channel wasn't the dominant channel type. It was what is referred to as an anastomose channel, multi-thread channel with all kinds of wood and debris, beaver dams, and these rivers ran through essentially wetlands. And so that was the stable, most probable form, and the rivers are naturally going back to that. So the question is, they're getting shallower, right? And if we let the wood come in, the channel's you're gonna get these multi-thread channels. The question is, can we let it do that? And everywhere. Where can we let it do that? Where can we not let it do that? So that's like where we get. So my point is that the rivers, it's filling, and we are adding gravel too, but I don't think we're adding so much gravel that that's the only cause of the river filling, right? There's a natural amount of material coming in too. But we are addressing, the state is trying to address the gravel off the roads. Whether it's working or not, that's like, I don't know. I don't have any information on that, right? So it is something that people are concerned about and trying to manage, whether it's working or not. But I hear your solution is like, let's get in there and take it out of the river.
No,
So,
I don't think we can take it all. I think we've done that mistake.
yeah.
I think we have to ease back.
Yeah. On the road gravel?
Well, no, let some dredging happen, so that we're not continually adding to the
Yeah.
problem.
Yeah. So,
We've done 50 years worth of damage.
yeah. Okay.
We
So
can't fix it overnight.
since 1986, dredging has been regulated, but it still happens. Last year, after the 23 flood, A&R issued, I think it was 250 permits across the state to remove gravel. Now, I don't know how that looks, like you spread out 250 permits. I don't know how much is happening everywhere, but so it is happening. And I think there's this, like I hear all the time that we don't dredge our rivers at all anymore. And that's not quite true. We are still dredging the rivers. It's being managed by engineers who understand all of this stuff so that we aren't doing damage unintentionally. Whether or not it's as much as you're saying, you think we should or not, I don't know. But so that's just the way it's happening now. We are still dredging. It's just really regulated and guided by engineers who understand all this stuff.
So I mean, talking about the within the river and everything. So here, Mad River, is there enough that we can do upstream that would have an impact by the time it hits, the bridges?
Yeah. So is there enough that we can do in the headwaters to the Mad to increase flood resiliency down here in the valley with respect to the bridges specifically? Okay. So when we talk about bridges and culverts, we understand now that the way that we used to size those structures, design those structures, wasn't sufficient. It was sized by a method often referred to as clear water hydraulics, meaning that the computations didn't include the need to pass sediment and debris, just water. And when you do that, you come up with a structure that's much smaller, and you can come up with structures that are much narrower than the natural channel. And when you do that, you create all kinds of instability because you're not allowing the sediment to pass through. It's dropping out on the upstream side, pushing the river around side to side. So when we talk about bridges and culverts and stability of those structures, a lot of that is the engineering of those structures and the fact that we need to build bigger culverts and bridges. And Vermont has taken that step. Going back to 2010, I think it was, the standards for design of bridges and culverts changed such that they had to be big enough to accommodate, essentially big enough to accommodate sediment and wood. So that's part of the equation. The other part of the equation is, as you asked about, and as I suggested, that we can do stuff in the headwaters. How much does it take in the headwaters to have a certain degree of impact? I don't know. I think it's a lot. But it's pretty cheap. And, if we can do that, I think it pushes us in the right direction. But I don't know how much it's going to take. But if you think about all the co-benefits, the improved habitat, right, the flood resiliency, flood resiliency and improved habitat, water quality, why not do it if it's cheap, right? Now, we do have to be careful. I'm talking a lot about, like I do mention wood and the importance of wood. We clearly recognize that wood can come into conflict with our infrastructure. So we mitigate that by, we don't do wood addition projects close, immediately upstream of infrastructure, right? And we do it very carefully when we're anywhere near infrastructure. We're well away from it, but we do it really carefully. So we're not blind to the fact that while wood can help, it also can impact infrastructure. We have to remain aware of that and vigilant. And we need to clear wood out of the stream sometimes when it's near infrastructure. We just, this approach of like every single stem has to come out, we've kind of gone overboard. And we need to take a little bit more of an informed approach to it and a more measured approach to it. And the same as with gravel mining. It's not that we don't ever need to remove gravel, but we've just done it in such a excessive manner that we just need to come back, and that's what we're trying to do. So yeah, maybe not where you want to see it, but it's a balance that we're trying to strike.
So I have a question. You said that you have 250 dredging permits a year, and yet after your talk, I would say, well, I guess we're probably not doing any dredging because it's detrimental to the system as a whole. Why do we think that we're so smart that we can do it in 250 places and not have, detrimental effects? And why are we not trying to move closer to zero and And maybe if there's some infrastructure, that we actually change the infrastructure and not change the river to accommodate the mistake in infrastructure.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is, if dredging the rivers, as I suggest, is so bad for flood resiliency and in-stream habitat, why are we issuing 250 permits in a year to remove gravel from rivers? And why do we think that we're so smart that we know how to do that in a way that's not detrimental, doesn't have those negative impacts that I talked about? So the answer generally is that we do have infrastructure that is susceptible to damage by gravel deposition. And as a short-term fix, it's really removing the gravel is a short-term and it's a repetitive maintenance approach. And it gets expensive over time and it does a lot of ecological damage over time and it destabilizes the river. So it's a short-term approach. The bigger, longer-term goals and approaches that we're taking, one, to increase the size of our infrastructure, as I just mentioned that we do, right? Bridges and culverts have to be bigger. We've improved the way that we do riprap jobs and we build road embankments, although I see some examples just coming from Huntington over here where those improvements haven't taken place on the ground, and I'm kind of curious as to why that is. And then we're protecting those river corridors to get structures out of the way so that we don't need to protect those structures by dredging and armoring the streams as well. So what you see right now is a combination of the immediate short-term must-do, dredging, channel management, but in the background or the longer-term effort is to implement these policy changes so that in the future we won't have to continue to do that.
But still, year after year, we're having the problem.
Yeah, well, okay, so yeah, I think as I frame the problem is that the rivers are too deep. So the rivers filling with gravel is not, so the rivers are too deep so that when the floodwaters come, those high flows can't escape onto the floodplain. They're trapped in the channel and you get all that extra energy in the channel, right? So every year the rivers are filling in is what you're seeing. And that's from a river erosion perspective, that's not bad. It's actually moving back to the natural pre-disturbance, the pre-settlement condition. We didn't have channels. The Mad River channel, the banks of the channel of the Mad River should not be this high. In nature, you don't find that where humans haven't come in and impacted the channel. The channel banks on the Mad River probably are somewhere around here in natural conditions. And that's so important because when the water gets that high, it's deep enough that it's putting excessive stress on the bed. And at that point, if the bank's only that high, it can spread out and all that energy gets dissipated across that broad floodplain. If the banks are that high, the water gets that deep, it starts eroding, it gets that deep, it erodes even more, it gets that deep, it's still eroding the bed even more, and it doesn't get out of the channel until it's that deep, and then it can spread out. By that time, the erosion is excessive, it's massive, the amount of erosion. So the low banks, which means filling the channel, so you get the low banks so the water can spread out, that's the pressure relief valve. It's just like on a home hydronic heating system, right? A boiler system. You always have a blow-off valve, right? Otherwise the pipes burst. The river is just an earthen pipe, right? It's just an earthen pipe. You need a pressure relief valve, and that's the floodplain.
With all the major floods, is there anything being done or as far as not rebuilding in the floodplain or opening up more channels, make it not a single channel?
Yeah. So is there anything more being done? Yeah, in the face of climate change and increasing flood hazards, is there anything being done to increase flood resiliency? And that's really that river corridor protection, recognizing where the river is going to move and not continuing to build in those places. And then with the places that exist, there's things like the FEMA buyout program, so that structures that are damaged. And that's not a great solution either, because we all know right now housing across Vermont is really difficult. So telling somebody, well, your flood got, we'll buy your house out and you can go find another house somewhere in Vermont. I think the reality is oftentimes they can't. So it's like if you look at fires out in California or hurricanes in Florida right now, like we're all facing these difficult natural disasters.
River Street, is the plan to let it develop meanders again inside that floodplain?
Yeah, so we've straightened rivers. Is the idea to let rivers meander again inside the floodplain? The answer is yes. The reason that we don't let rivers meander is because it's when the river meandering comes into conflict with human investment, right? If there's a house, the state is not going to condemn a house by saying that the house owner can't rip-rap the bank or straighten the river. So that happens. If there's no structure there, then the river can meander. So if we can stop building in the river corridors, and we're at a pretty good place in Vermont, right? I mean, relative to New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, New York, right? We haven't built out our river corridors yet. So taking the step is really going to help. Then the rivers can meander and regain the length that they need to decrease the slope to come into balance with the power or resistance of the channel.
You can't buy out a house, but what about the farmers that lose so much land?
Yeah, it's almost an intractable problem, right? We moved into this landscape, and Europeans moved into Europe. It's not just us, right? And they saw that beautiful, flat, fertile land, and they cut down the trees, and lots of times they straightened and deep ditched the channels so that those fields wouldn't flood, and we produced food there for hundreds of years. And that's what we do. But now we recognize that is creating a problem, an erosion problem, transportation infrastructure failing, buildings getting failed, that is seriously expensive that we can't continue to pay to recover from. So what do? I don't have a great answer for that. We need to balance our food production systems with our management of that river resource in such a way that we can supply ourselves with enough food, but not create such extensive damage that we go broke trying to recover from that. I think we've all seen the reports about how from time to time FEMA is effectively broke because Congress can't act to refund, flood disaster coffers. So we're kind of headed in that direction. What do we do? How do we solve that problem? It's really a hard one. I don't know if we can say you farm up on the East Warren Plateau, you farm in Addison County where you don't have big river, you farm along these rolling hills. I don't want to suggest, it goes through my mind, but I hate to even say it because people get really upset by that, even thinking like that. And I understand it. I really appreciate local agriculture, and I know it's an important part of this economy, and it's an important part of our heritage. I just don't have a great answer. I don't have a great answer.
You had some nice examples of some restoration work you've done. It looks like on tributary streams. Have you done any, or do you think it's possible on the larger, like for instance, the Mad River? Have you been able to do any, even a small scale pilot of a?
Yeah, good question. So the question was, have we been able to do any restoration on streams larger than those that I've shown? And the answer is we've tried and partially succeeded. In the context is that government agencies and others tend to focus on bigger rivers because it just seems like they're doing more. And those efforts around the globe really are challenging. It's challenging to document a lot of benefits coming out of those projects in general. Not that there aren't any that have succeeded. So there's been a real push by the scientific restoration community to focus on the smaller streams. A lot of the science shows that smaller streams are more important from a habitat perspective. If we talk about the importance of riparian buffers, you get a lot more bang for your buck on small streams because there's a lot more land area to stream surface area. So those buffers are really doing a lot more. So the push right now really seems to be going towards the smaller streams. And the other part that influences that is that you don't typically have as many conflicts, at least on the forest, in the forested setting. In small agricultural streams, you still have conflicts, but once you get down to the Mad River, the White River, there's so much infrastructure and human investment that it's really hard to design a true restoration project in those settings. Richard.
Maybe you could explain a little bit about the concept of veins and protecting the riverbank by putting in the either trees or rock.
Yeah.
Pointing upstream so it eddies and fills in behind it.
Yeah.
A lot less effort.
Yeah.
And cost.
Yeah. So the comment was about a technique referred to as river veins to protect banks from erosion. And river veins are an alternative to riprap. Riprap is just adding rock to the bank, just lining that bank with rock. River veins are structures, either rock or wood, trees or rock, that stick out into the river. They can be different angles. I feel like there's debate about that. But the idea is that they redirect the water away from the bank out into the middle of the channel. And they do that. And they encourage sediment deposition right along that bank. They slow velocity along the bank. So it's, in some respects, it's a less expensive, more effective, more aesthetically pleasing. In some cases, you can build fish habitat into that structure. You can put a hook on the end of it and creates a scour pool out in the middle. So that's an effort that's been used. The Friends of the Mad River have built some veins. Upriver from LaRue, there's a series of veins. None at the 1824 bend, I don't think. That was all planting. And they tend to work until those rocks get moved or the wood gets moved, but everything river restoration is temporary. Those dynamic forces are always at play, but it is an approach that in many respects is better than riprap, although there are some fisheries biologists who debate that. But that's sort of a restorative sort of activity that can be used and has been done on the Mad River. So it's not that nothing's done on larger channels and sort of the restoration effort. It's just that I think practitioners and scientists are moving us towards smaller streams. Yeah. All right.
Let's have a hand for Shane.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
So just a couple of quick announcements, sort of piggybacking off of this idea of restoration projects and things that you might be able to get involved with. There are 2 tree plantings that are coming up in the next few weeks. One of them is on Mill Brook this coming Sunday, October 20th, which is in partnership with the Recreation Hub. If you've seen the new bridge that comes across Mill Brook, we're going to be planting about 400 trees along that buffer right there and working to enhance both from a biodiversity standpoint, but also the flood resilience of that area that we've seen flood over and over again right across from like Mad Rover. And then on November 3rd, we're going to be continuing some of our work at LaRue. You've probably seen that there's a lot of tree plantings. There's been significant efforts at knotweed removal, which is another component of erosive tendencies of our rivers right now. And so part of that is removing knotweed, which has really minimal root structure that holds together our soils, and replacing that with trees. So if you're interested in that, you can always just find me right after here, and we can get you signed up and let you know what that's going to look like, provide some more details on it. But really, we're looking to partner these types of educational experiences with opportunities for people to actually take action and do something in their community. So, yes.
I just want to make sure I get give the impression that efforts like that aren't worthwhile, because trees, we put dead wood or we cut trees into the river. If you don't have trees on the banks, that's never going to happen. I mean, that's a natural process that we're trying to restart. So trees on the banks help. And then the root systems of those trees are holding the soil and the banks together. So if I in any way gave you the impression like on big rivers don't bother doing anything, I apologize. Certainly planting trees is always a great thing to be doing.
And I mean, if you look at like even the shade that's provided by significant, talking about cooler water temperatures and fish habitat, really crucial. So
Thanks.
So thank you for your time tonight. We will be around, take some snacks with you. Thank you for showing up. Thanks to anybody who's watching on live stream. And once again, thanks, Shane.
Yeah.
So the tree planting, show up there what time are you? Sure. So Sundays happen yeah, and this is a Monday celebration celebrating 30 years of recreation this year. So beyond my